All right, looks like we are live, and I want to welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny, and I am your host and moderator for tonight's King James Bible debate. Specifically, we are debating the question, is Easter the wrong translation? And it is a privilege, as always, to have two experienced debaters here with me, Nick Sayers and TurretinFan. Definitely no strangers to debates, nor strangers to this topic, the topic of the King James Bible controversy and Bible translations. Given the fact that we just had Easter over the weekend, I hope everybody had a fantastic Easter weekend where they could eat lots, celebrate the death, burial, and resurrection of our Lord, of course. And so this is the perfect time, I think, to debate this important question. So with that, Nick and Turretin, I want to thank you both for giving us your time for this important debate. And what I'd like to do before we get into the debate itself is kind of get acquainted, break the ice a little bit. For anybody not familiar with you gentlemen, a little bit about ourselves. So Turretin, let's start with you. Thank you so much for being here. As always, giving us your time for these debates. A little bit about yourself and a little bit about your channel.
Well, I'm a Reformed blogger. I've been blogging for about the last, around the last 15 years or so, and focusing most of my discussions on a broad range of theological topics, but focusing mostly on issues related to Calvinism, Roman Catholicism, and more recently, there's been a little bit more of an emphasis on discussing the King James Version, but plenty of other areas of discussion as well, including also recently an emphasis on responding to the proponents of the free grace soteriology. And this is I think I'm starting to lose track, and it's not that big a number yet, but it's maybe our third debate, but Nick and mine. So looking forward to, again, another good interaction.
That means this will complete the debate trilogy between Nick Sayers and TurretinFan. After this one, we'll have to start a new trilogy. So you both always make for excellent debates. I appreciate how well prepared both of you come to these debates. I see you both on your channels doing lots of response videos, lots of prep videos. And so I'm really pumped to see what you both are going to bring to the table tonight in terms of this topic. To the audience, if you like what you're hearing from tonight's guests, TurretinFan, who just gave his intro, the relevant links are posted in the description box. And so you can check out their YouTube channels or their blog pages and find out more about them and what they have to say. So Nick Sayers, always a pleasure as well. Good to have you back. How have you been? Happy Easter, and a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, good to see you, Donny. So my name's Nick Sayers, and I'm constantly on the internet trying to persuade people that the King James Bible is a reliable translation and that it is without error. And so this takes up a lot of my time. It's one of my hobbies. Some people love golf. Some people love horses and things like that. I love doing this. And I've been involved in Bible translation work. And oftentimes I'm watching debates about this topic. I guess it's one of those things. Everyone has their little rabbit hole that they go down and they become acquainted with the arguments. And so Easter is one of the first issues that I actually covered. And I wasn't a King James only, as people get labeled. I wasn't a King James onlyist when I actually came to this conclusion that Easter was correct in the King James. And it was one of the issues that actually turned me to look at more issues. And I realized that the King James was without translational error. And so, so that's me. And lately I've just been very busy. I'm a busy guy, but I love the Bible, I love the Word of God, and I like seeing people getting activated into a sense where they can trust the words of God. They can pick up the Bible, and it's like getting the mouth of God and opening it and letting the words of God speak to them and change their life. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for that introduction. Again, same thing with you. To the audience, you want to hear more from Nick. His YouTube channel is linked in the description box for people to check out. Round one, if I'm not mistaken, between Nick and Turretin was a more general errors in the King James Bible debate. Fantastic debate. Last month, we debated unicorns in the Bible. Important debate. Lots of great feedback there. Comprehensive on that topic. And tonight, again, the question is Easter the wrong translation? I'm pumped for this, and so is the audience. And so let's just go over the format real quick. It is going to be a formal debate. We're going to have 15-minute opening statements, followed by 8-minute rebuttals. Then we're going to have a 50-minute discussion. We're going to break that up into 2 25-minute periods of cross-examination. Then we'll have a 5-minute concluding statement where the debaters can wrap up their thoughts and points for the debate. And then, as always, this is where we get you guys in the audience involved. We'll have a roughly 25 to 30-minute audience Q&A. And so if you got questions for our debaters, Nick Sayers or TurretinFan, let me know who the question is for and tag me either at Standing for Truth or at Donny, and that way I won't miss your questions. Okay, so with that, we are going to get into the first 15-minute opening statement, and that is going to go to TurretinFan. When you're ready, Turretin, let me know. If you need me to get your slides up as well, just make sure to unmute, and I will.
If you could put the slides up, that'd be great. And then,
Sure.
All right. Thanks very much. I'm looking forward to this discussion of the question of Acts 12:4. The correct word that's mentioned there in Acts 12:4 should be Passover, not Easter. And I'm defending it against the reading of Acts 12:4, namely Passover. I'm defending that against anachronism. Now, today's debate, the debate's over the correct English translation of a single Greek word. The word is Pascha. Both the modern critical text and the Textus Receptus have exactly the same words and letters in this particular verse. So it's not a question of the Greek, it's a question of the English. The first point, Pascha's first century range of meaning, Pascha's change in meaning in the 2nd or 3rd century, Pascha as used by Luke, the author of Acts, Pascha's meaning in context, Pascha's Passover, not Easter, in Acts 12:4. Easter's meaning from 971 to 1530 in English, and then Easter's meaning in English by 1611. And then, if time permits, the fact that 17th century theologians, the Trinitarian Bible Society, Brian Ross, and other King James Version supporters do agree with my central point, even if they would disagree with me on other points. The debate, again, is over the translation of Acts 12:4. Acts 12:4 says, and when he had apprehended him, he, being Herod, had apprehended him, meaning Peter, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers, that's 16 soldiers, to keep him, intending after Pascha to bring him forth to the people. And I contend that Pascha here should be Passover, not Easter, as the King James currently reads. Pascha, also sometimes Fasek, is a transliteration. It's a transliteration of the Hebrew word Pesach, or my Hebrew pronunciation is terrible, but it's a Hebrew word, and that's the word that we usually now today translate as Passover. There's been some questions about what's the etymology of the word. It sounds a bit like some other Greek words, like the word Pascho, which means to undergo or endure. And people like Melito of Sardis, following some tradition, suggested that to celebrate the Passover is derived from the word that means to suffer, which is an interesting idea, but it's not correct. In fact, as Eusebius of Caesarea and Origen both claim, the word is a transliteration of the Hebrew word. The semantic domain of Pascha. The original domain, the domain from the time it was coined by Jewish translators of Scripture. It wasn't an existing Greek word that was put to new use. It was a word that was created by the Jewish translators of Scripture. It was used by the Septuagint for Passover. It was used by Ezekiel, the tragedist, an intertestamental writer, as well by Philo of Alexandria, or Philo the Judean, I think is another name for him. But in any event, he also used it for Passover. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, and the author of Hebrews all use it to describe the Passover. And Josephus uses it to describe the Passover. Justin Martyr and other early Christian writers likewise use it to describe the Passover. In modern Greek, the domain of that word has expanded, and now it also refers to the Christian celebration of Jesus' resurrection. So what I'm calling Resurrection Day, just for clarity. The semantic domain of Passover, namely Pesach or Pascha, what does it mean? Well, the primary main sense, the sense that it was given when it's originally defined in Exodus 12, is a 7-day feast, also known as the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and it extends from the 14th day of the first month, which is the month Abib, also known as Nisan, from the time of the captivity onward. But it's from that day until the 21st. It's a feast of 7 days. So Luke 22:1 says, now the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover. So these two are terms that can mean the same thing. They don't always mean the same thing, but they can mean the same thing. 2 Chronicles 35:17 says, and the children of Israel that were present kept the Passover at that time and the Feast of Unleavened Bread 7 days. So as you can see, there's not a second verb in there. It's one thing. The Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, 7 days. They're described with different words, but it's all one big feast. Ezekiel 45:21 makes that explicit. The Passover, a feast of 7 days. Unleavened bread shall be eaten. Matthew 26:17 says, now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying unto him, where wilt thou that we prepare for thee to eat the Passover? Now, if it was the first day of unleavened bread is the day after Passover, on the morrow after Passover, then it would be odd for them to be asking Jesus where he's going to take the Passover, because that would be a full year away if these are two separate things. But in fact, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is the day on which the Passover lamb is killed. Sometimes let me put it this way. It's noteworthy that this says the first day of the feast, indicating that there's more than one day. It's not the only day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's the first day. And that's because the author of Matthew, namely Matthew or Levi, he was referring to this 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread, which starts with the Passover proper. Mark 14:1, after 2 days was the feast of the Passover and of unleavened bread. So you see the word feast is modified by of the Passover and of unleavened bread. One feast named the Passover and of unleavened bread. Exodus 12:18 describes it this way. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at even. But, caveat here, sometimes the day on which the lamb was killed is described as the Passover. So when I say Passover proper, sometimes it's narrowly referring just to that one day. Numbers 33:3 refers to the morrow after the Passover, referring to the historical event of the Passover there. But Joshua 4:11 talks about the morrow after the Passover, talking about the feast being celebrated as a memorial. Sometimes the lamb itself is referred to as the Passover. So Mark 14:12 says, in the first day of the unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover. Luke 22:1 says, now the Feast of Unleavened Bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover. And I think that's actually a mistake to have that one in there. That's talking about the feast. But the third one is correct. 1 Corinthians 5:7, purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. For even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. So that's the victim, the lamb that's killed. And then sometimes it's the meal. So Matthew 26:17-19 says, now the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying unto him, where wilt thou that we should prepare for thee to eat the Passover? And he said, go into the city to such a man, and say unto him, the master says, my time's at hand. I will keep the Passover at thy house with my disciples. And the disciples did as Jesus had appointed them, and they made ready the Passover. When did it come to be used? When did Pascha come to be used for Resurrection Day? Being definitive on this point is hard, though by Eusebius in the late 3rd century, it had to some extent such a use. There's more detail available on that point. Mid to late 2nd century or even 3rd century seems like a good guess as to when it started to have this meaning of Resurrection Day. For example, even in the account of Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea, which fixed the date for the imperial Christians to celebrate Pascha, it seems unclear whether it was a celebration over Passover or a celebration of the resurrection. Melito of Sardis wrote a peri Pascha, meaning on the Passover. And he briefly mentions resurrection, but it's not the focus of his treatise. Similarly, Origen's peri Pascha on the Passover doesn't focus on the resurrection at all. There is some brief mention of resurrection in there, but it's not the focus of his treatise. There's also a question about Polycarp. Eusebius claimed that Polycarp and Anicetus discussed the celebration around 155, but did that discussion actually happen? It's hard to establish that in a reliable way. And if so, was it about Easter or was it about Passover? And that's even harder to prove since we don't have any great resources on that point. All 7 other uses of Pascha in the New Testament are, okay, so the New Testament uses Pascha 29 times, 28 times it's translated as Passover, and just 1 time it's not, namely in this time in Acts 12. But Luke is also the author of Luke, and 7 times it's used in Luke, every time it's Passover. In fact, from the 2nd century BC through the 2nd century AD, setting aside Acts 12:4, every single use of Pascha means Passover, from the coining of the word at least until the 2nd century, maybe later. That includes 28 other times in the New Testament where the King James translators kept the translation or changed it to Passover. And that includes 14 other times in the Septuagint where the King James Version has Passover. And that includes uses by Philo, Ezekiel the tragedist, and Josephus. It always meant Passover up to the point where Luke wrote Acts. Context demonstrates that it refers to the Passover. Acts 12:1-4 says, "Now about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread. And when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Pascha to bring him forth to the people. So he saw that it pleased the Jews," that's the same as the people there in verse 4, "and he seized Peter to kill him, but it was the days of unleavened bread," which Luke in Luke 22, which we already read, said is the Passover, is the Pascha. And he says intending after Pascha to bring him forth to the people. Why would he do that? Because the Jewish people would be unhappy with killing someone during the feast, or at least that was Herod's perception. Herod's intent was to please the Jews, but Matthew 26:5 says, this is talking about the Jewish leaders, they said, "Not on the feast day, lest there be an uproar among the people." They wanted to kill Jesus, but they didn't want to do it on the feast day because they were worried about a riot. Same thing in Mark 14:2. And similarly in Luke 22:1-2, it's even more specific. It says, "Now the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh," which is called the Passover, "and the chief priests and scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people." They were concerned about what the people would do, and they wanted to try to find a way. And if you remember what happens, they go and arrest him at night when there was not so many people around. What about Easter? Could it be Easter? It couldn't be Easter because literally every other use of the word Pascha for the century before and after means Passover, including every use in Scripture, the Apocrypha, intertestamental literature, and every use by Luke. Luke literally defines Pascha as the Feast of Unleavened Bread in Luke 22:1. There's no Easter feast when Peter was captured. There was no Easter feast when Luke wrote Acts. The earliest celebrations of Pascha among the Christians seem to have been on the first day, meaning on the actual day of killing the Passover lamb. And even imagining that there were some post-Nicene resurrection celebrations called Pascha, Herod wouldn't care about those. His idea was not to please the Christians, it was to please the Jews. In fact, it's not even clear that Herod would know some uniquely distinctive Christian aspect of the religion, although it's possible, but it's not clear he would. So there's an impassable mountain here. But now I'm going to refute myself. Dr. Sam Gipp, I'm indebted to him for this turn of phrase in one of his presentations on the same topic. He takes a different position from Nick, and he has no connection to Nick, but this "now I'm going to refute myself" was a nice turn, and I will now refute myself to some extent. The semantic range of the English word Easter has to be taken into account. Since at least 971, Old English, Middle English, and early modern English used the word Easter in various spellings to refer both to Passover and Easter. This is demonstrated from the Oxford English Dictionary, 1911, Volume 3, the E section, page 19, left column, Definition 2 says the Jewish Passover obsolete. And you can see it actually has that meaning there for the 1611 Bible, Acts 12:4, intending after Easter to bring him forth. According to the OED, that meant Passover. But you can see it also goes back. Coverdale has it in his Bible. There's uses back through 971. So Tyndale, when he translated in 1523 or so, about almost exactly 500 years ago, when he translated, he used Easter correctly to translate Pascha, because Easter was the normal English word for Passover. And he subsequently translated part of the Old Testament and coined the word Passover. It didn't exist till he made it up about 5 to 7 years after he translated that part of the New Testament. Coverdale used Easter in a portion of the Old Testament that wasn't translated by Tyndale, but ever since, the Bibles in the Tyndale family standardized towards using Passover. The Bishop's Bible had used Easter to describe Passover only in 2 verses, John 11:55 and Acts 12:4. The King James Version translators updated John 11:55, but they didn't update Acts 12:4. They should have, because it was already becoming archaic, and they didn't. There was a split of progress in the English Bibles, which I won't belabor too much, but the Geneva Bible got it right in 1560 and maintained that into the late 1590s. The theologians that were in the 1600s came to the same conclusion that Easter here means Passover, or should be translated as Passover, and so did so have the modern Bibles, many King James advocates. And in conclusion, Easter is the wrong translation of Pascha. Easter was the right translation 500 years ago when Tyndale used it. By 1611, it was already archaic, and today it is obsolete.
Thank you, TurretinFan. 15 minutes on the dot. Thank you so much for that opening statement. I do want to let the audience know that I am all caught up on questions as well. And so, Nick Sayers, we are going to hand it over to you whenever you're ready. You also have 15 minutes for an opening statement. Go ahead.
Cheers. Thanks, Donny. And so the word Easter in about 2002, I was faced with a situation where I was out street preaching and inviting people out to an Easter service. And I was handing out tracts, and a lady walked past, and I said, "Do you want to come to an Easter service?" And she said, "Why would I go to your church and learn about a pagan goddess?" And I just went, "Yeah, you're correct." I didn't know what to say. I was just sort of slapped in the face. And so that following Sunday, the pastor of the church said, "Does anyone here know what Easter means?" And I put my hand up and said, "It's a pagan festival." And he sort of did the same thing. He went, "Yeah, it is." And after that, I was just very confused. And so I started studying. I found a very good article by a guy called Scott Jones. Now, at the time, I wasn't a King James only sort of person. Our church used to read the New King James. And I used to think that the New King James was just an update of the Old King James, but I've proven that wrong many times. And so what happened was I started to study Easter and look through this word, and I came across an amazing revelation, because I thought it was a pagan thing. And so obviously TurretinFan doesn't believe this. There are some people out there on both sides. So D.A. Waite, Jack Mormon, they formerly were saying that Easter was a pagan festival. James White, he says it's a pagan festival. But it seems more and more people are coming full circle. People like even Mark Ward, Wes Huff, I noticed he was saying this just a few hours ago on his Facebook, saying it's not a pagan festival. Atheists are coming full circle and saying it's not a pagan festival. So the whole concept of it being related to paganism, and even the eggs, the pagan goddesses that they're pointing to had nothing to do with eggs, had nothing to do with bunnies. So the whole thing is just ridiculous, going to a pagan festival type of thing. So with that out of the way, then we look at is the translation of Acts chapter 12, verse 4, a mistranslation, or is it just an old redundant word? Okay. So in my first article, I went through and proved, and I'll just read this quote from my first article. So I wrote this in 2005. So Ustern, being the modern day correspondent, is relating to Ust. which means the rising of the sun, or simply in English, east. Uster comes from the old Teutonic form of Erfurchterhen, Erfurchterhang, which means resurrection. In the older Teutonic form, it comes from two words, Erster, meaning first, and Stehen, meaning to stand. These two words combine to form Erstehen, which is an old German form of Erfurchterhen, the modern day word for resurrection. And so the etymology of Easter goes through, we can even look at the Luther Bible. It has Uster instead of, it's basically related to Erfurchterhang. So the word Easter actually means resurrection. That's the correct etymology of the word. And so understanding that it means resurrection, when we look at the term Easter, in the Greek, even if you go to a modern Greek dictionary, if you look up Pascha, the word Pascha, it means Easter. If you talk to any Greek person and you say Happy Pascha, they go, wow, you have a good Easter as well. It means Easter. And so you have to put the Hebrew or Jewish Pascha there for them to go, oh, you're talking about the Passover. And so in modern Greek, it's like that. But it was also the same in the early church writings. And so in the early church writings, they had the Easter controversies. And so they talked about Easter so much that it was one of the hot topics in the early church. So they were talking about the Pascha, and they were using this same word that they used for Passover for this Christian celebration. So when did this Christian celebration start? In my second article, if you go to the website easterau.com, you can go through my 3 articles there. I've made 2 videos on these as well. So if you go through there, in my second article, someone like Gerhard Kittel, now I don't agree with Kittel's, he was a Nazi. He actually got imprisoned for war crimes. But he wrote an interesting lexicon. And so he said Pascha came to be called Easter in the celebration of the resurrection within the primitive church. Now, some of these people I quote because they're on the text critical side. Other people I quote because they're on our side, but I haven't really got time to distinguish between them. When we look at Alfred Erdeshim, he was a Messianic Jew in the 19th century. He said of the Last Supper, it was to be the last of the old Paschas and the first, or rather symbol of promise, of the new. So he clearly knew that every Pascha from the time of the cross was to be the new Pascha, not the old. So we understand that when the resurrection happened, an amazing thing happened. There was a division between the old covenant and the new covenant. We no longer had to be obligated to, circumcise. We no longer, now some of these things took a while to be enforced, but there was no longer an obligation for people to obey the laws. When you have Christ in you, you tick all the 613 law boxes, and God is well pleased with you. He looks down on you and says, "This is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased," because you're married to Christ. He looks down and says, "There's my son, I'm well pleased." He looks at you and says that. And so the thing is, after the resurrection, everything changed. The law became redundant. The Passover, the old festival of getting the lamb on the 14th of Nisan and killing it and putting, roasting it at certain times of the day, and then having the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then having, the Feast of First Fruits and things like that. That was all shadows. The fulfillment was Christ, that he died. I believe he died on a Thursday. Christ died the exact same time that they were killing all the Passover lambs all over Israel, or specifically around Jerusalem. And so he died at that time, fulfilling all the Old Testament prophecies of the Passover. And so when he resurrected, everything changed. It wasn't just, the Christians weren't just going to practice the same as the Jews. They knew that Jesus was the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, that the old lamb was just a symbol. It was a type. It's a shadow. And so the King James translators, they were intelligent guys. They understood these things. These are basic sort of concepts. So when they were going through the Bible, they realized that in 28 times the word Pascha appears. It's in an Old Testament sense. It's talking about, Jesus obeying the Passover, or, they celebrated a Passover and they killed the lamb and they did these other things. Or it's talking about, in Moses' day, they celebrated the Passover. But there's only one place which in the historical narrative is after the resurrection. And so that's in the book of Acts. So we know Acts is after the resurrection. In the book of Acts, chapter 12, verse 4, the semantic domain of Pascha there warrants that it would be a celebration of the resurrection there. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, Herod's not interested in the Christians or the resurrection. We don't know. Herod might have been very interested in the Christians, but that's not my argument. The issue is Luke was writing the book of Acts. He was a born-again, Bible-believing Christian filled with the Holy Spirit, okay? So the Jews, they continually celebrated their feasts and did their stuff. So they did that Passover, and they continue to do that, and they still continue to do that today. Now, the Christians, they started celebrating it differently, okay? And so they started celebrating the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so it makes a lot of sense if you understand that the Christians and the Jews were both celebrating this festival in the same week. The Christians were just going, well, we're celebrating Pascha, and that's we celebrate it because Jesus is risen. The Jews were like, oh, we're celebrating it because Moses taught us to celebrate it that way. They're both looking at the same coin. There's one coin, but there's two sides of it. The Christians look at one side and say, Jesus is risen. He's the Lamb of God. That's what Luke would have looked at. The Jews were looking at it saying exactly the same thing, exactly the same week, exactly the same festival, the Passover, which the Christians called Easter. Now, this usually isn't an issue in most languages, because most languages just use the same word. Pasch or Pascha, or usually something to do with the word Pascha, which comes from the Hebrew word Pesach. So when we come to the English, Tyndale actually coined the word Passover. So before that, they used to say the Jewish Easter for Passover, okay? They used to just say Easter for the resurrection celebration, okay? Tyndale did that in his Bible, but when he started doing the Old Testament, he got to Exodus 12 and went, hang on, the word Easter actually means resurrection. It just seems a bit funny talking about this lamb and everything in the Old Testament when it's sort of like the resurrection's so far away. And so what he did is he actually coined the word. He probably got it from Luther, his Passover. Now, he created two words. So then when he went back to doing a revision of his New Testament, he started to use the word Easter just in the New Testament and Passover just in the Old Testament. But he died. And so unfortunately, he wasn't able to finish his work. So the King James translators, they looked at what he began to do, and he created these two words where formerly there was mostly just one word used. So he now has these two words, and the King James translators skillfully put Passover everywhere before the resurrection in the historical narrative, and then once as Easter in Acts chapter 12, verse 4. And so we can see many quotations by historians that, like, say, for example, around 120 AD, Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, went to see the Christian leader Anicetus to discuss the proper date of the celebration. Polycarp, a bishop of Smyrna, visited Rome to confer with him about the controversy of the date of Easter. Those in Asia celebrated it on the movable weekday of the 14th of Nisan. That was the day they killed the Passover. While those in Rome, they did it according to the different calendars. So they weren't following the Jewish calendar. They were following, I think it was the solar calendar of their day. And so they did it the Sunday after Passover. So they decided to let each group continue as they'd been doing rather than cause a split. But we can see by 120 AD, all the churches were celebrating this thing called Pascha in the Greek. So we have two words in English, thanks to Tyndale, and we go, okay, the Old Testament, we call it Passover. The New Testament is called Easter. And that's the usage that we have today. A lot of people get confused because the Passover feast is usually celebrated according to a different calendar, and we go usually by what was organized in the Council of Nicaea. And so the Sunday after the equinox and things like that. But it makes a lot of sense if you understand they were actually the same week. So the Christians looked at one side of the coin, the Jews looked at the other side of the coin, but they were both looking at the same thing. But inside of them, they were seeing different things. One was seeing on one side of the coin the resurrection of Christ, the others were seeing just the law of Moses and all that sort of stuff. And so the King James translators, knowing this, they just went, well, Luke wrote this, and so it's fine to put Easter in there. So Henry Saville, who was one of the translators, he actually compiled 15,800 manuscript sheets of the works of Chrysostom. So Chrysostom was an early Greek church writer, and so Chrysostom was obsessed with quartodecimanism, which were people who were celebrating on the 14th. And so he used to write against this. Now, Henry Saville, he translated all of Chrysostom's work into English. It was a huge work. Now, he was one of the translators who did the Book of Acts. So he was perfectly capable to do this. He didn't do it by mistake. These translators knew all about the Easter controversies.
30 seconds.
Understanding of this. And so at the end of the day, at the Book of Acts, chapter 12, verse 4, it is put in by design. And so it's there so that we can know that there is a distinction between the old shadow and type and the fulfillment, which is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And the King James translators perfectly put this into Acts chapter 12, verse 4.
Nick, thank you very much for that 15-minute opening statement. Great job to the both of you, Nick and TurretinFan. Very comprehensive. Appreciate the work put into those opening statements. Lots of points to rebut and to discuss. This is going to be epic for sure. So we're now moving into 8-minute uninterrupted rebuttals. And TurretinFan, we are going to hand it over to you whenever you're ready. You've got 8 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I will do my best to answer all of that. There's about, I think, 15 or so separate arguments the way I counted them, but I'll try to respond to each in its due turn. So, keeping that in mind, where can we start? Well, let's start with, let's see. Now I've perhaps misplaced my notes. 1 second, I will pull them back up. And here we go. Contrary to popular opinion, Easter is not a pagan festival. I certainly agree with that point, that it wasn't a pagan festival unless the Bede was right, but who knows, that was a really long time ago, and it really has nothing to do with our debate today. Is the translation a mistranslation or an old redundant word? As I said, when Tyndale did it, it was the right word. It wasn't even old or redundant when he did it, but by the 1611, it was already archaic. Today, it's obsolete, the meaning of Easter as Passover. So it was originally intended as Passover, and the King James translator's intent is something we should keep in mind. The word Easter means rising of the sun, we're told, and it has a connection to the word resurrection. It is odd that it was used for so many hundreds of years to describe the Jewish Passover, when, like, from 971 to, like, for about 500 years, it was used to describe the Jewish Passover. If it means resurrection, that's an odd coincidence, but if it is, so be it. It doesn't change the argument here at all. There was a comment that modern Greeks use Pascha for both. Indeed, they do, but that's a modern trend. It's influenced by church usage, which has come to be, as I mentioned, it's now been for many hundreds of years, over 1,000 years, it's been used that way among the Greeks. but that's really irrelevant to what Luke was using it. He said it was used in the early church as well. I mean, the Eusebius is pretty early, so yes, it was used in the early church. Kittle says the primitive church. I don't know what exactly he means by the primitive church, and unless he has something to support it other than Kittle, I don't see much point to focus on that issue. The next point was that Alfred Edersheim says that the Passover that Jesus celebrated with his disciples was the last of the old, the first of the new. I'm fine with that description, except that that's talking about the Lord's Supper, not an Easter Resurrection Day celebration. Two different things. The old festival died out. Well, did it or didn't it? I mean, the Quartodeciman controversy was there because people were celebrating Passover on Passover. And they were Christians celebrating Passover, and they had started to transform it a bit, for sure. But nevertheless, it was a Passover celebration, at least for that chunk of the people who were celebrating it on that day. And perhaps for the others as well. It's not completely clear, and we would need to have more historical evidence to buttress an idea to the contrary. The fulfillment is Christ. Amen to that. Everything changed when the resurrection came. It did, although, as Nick acknowledged, some things probably took some time to sort out. And the bottom line is, we don't even know whether Peter and the other Jews in Acts 12, in that time period, were celebrating Passover with the Jews or separately from them. In any event, Passover was celebrated on a family-by-family basis, or it was supposed to be celebrated on a family-by-family basis. So they would have been separated from others in any event. The King James translators were intelligent guys. No doubt they were, but that doesn't mean that they skillfully arranged things here. First of all, they inherited a New Testament called in the form of the Bishop's Bible, which had 27, not 28, but 27 of the place, or I shouldn't even say 27 because there were two uses in one verse. So 26 places where the word Pascha had been translated as Passover, and then 3 where 2 verses, but 2 in one and 1 in the other, verses where it said Easter, meaning Passover. They corrected John 11:55, but they didn't correct Acts 12:4. And I say correct, they updated the language. That's what I mean by correct. And they should have done it here for consistency and because it conveys the wrong sense. It was already starting to do so when they provided it. And yes, they're smart, but just keep in mind that they themselves didn't adhere to this new, alleged new skillful arrangement. Lancelot Andrewes used Easter to refer to the Passover in a sermon in 1618. Henry Saville, who published Chrysostom's homilies, including those on Acts, and was part of this translation group, he translated, he did not translate Chrysostom's works, unfortunately. I think that was a misstatement. And it was the day of unleavened bread, Chrysostom's homily says. Again, the idle preciseness of the Jews. To kill indeed they forbade not, but at such a time they did such things. So the point of Chrysostom's comment there was to note that there was a wickedness on the part of the people who were going about to kill Jesus, and in this case as well, thinking to kill Peter. So yes, they were smart and they were resourceful. Also, George Abbott in 1600, another one on the same Oxford Second Company of Translators that translated this portion. He also used, in 1600, he used Easter as equivalent to Passover in his writings. And there's no comments from them afterwards saying, oh no, we've changed the meaning. Now it exclusively means the resurrection. So they were just using words that were a little bit archaic, but now they're obsolete, and it would be the wrong translation now. Luke wrote Acts. He was a Bible-believing Christian, Spirit-filled, yes, but he was writing about Herod's intent. That's why it's critical. What did Herod want? Not so much what Luke wanted. Christians, there was a mention of Polycarp going to see Anicetus, allegedly around 120. I think you'll find that Anicetus' time as alleged Bishop of Rome in that is really dated more towards the 150s. In any event, this story is it true? Where is it reported? Well, allegedly, it was originally reported by Irenaeus's treatise on the Passover, but we don't have that. It doesn't exist anymore. Eusebius says that it was so, but we can't validate whether the writing he's relying on is legitimate or not. So as I said, by the time of Eusebius, yes, but before that, it's hard to say with any reliability. I think that answers the question, the points that were raised. I suppose I would just add, this is, although Passover was a word created by Tyndale, and as was said, perhaps borrowed from Luther or other Germans, there had been other English words for Passover before. There's an Old English word, Fareld, that was used, and in some places, phase, P-H-A-S-E, was used to indicate it. But ultimately, Passover by 1611 was the clear word to distinguish between Passover and Easter, and it should have been used here to avoid the kind of misunderstanding we have when we read it today.
Turretin, thank you very much for that 8-minute rebuttal. Nick Sayers, we are now going to hand it over to you. Whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. 8 minutes. Go ahead.
Thanks, Donny, and thanks, Turretin. So in modern Greek, the modern Greeks, they just say Pascha, but that's exactly the same as how the early church would talk about it. That they would say Pascha, and they had to define it with the Jewish Pascha if they were talking about the Passover. So if they just used Pascha, everyone assumed they were talking about Easter, or what we would label as English-speaking people with two words, Passover and Easter. They would we would label that as the resurrection celebration. And so it's been the same in Greek for 2,000 years. And so when we look at the book of John, it's quite interesting. He mentions a few times, I've got 2 examples here, I think there's 3, but it says in John chapter 2, verse 13, it has, and the Jews' Passover was at hand. Now, why would he say the Jews' Passover? That's because the Gentiles were also celebrating a Pascha. So the word here is Pascha. So the Jews' Pascha was at hand. And this is exactly how the early church writers would make that distinction as well. This is exactly how the Greeks today make that distinction as well. They say the Jews' Pascha, okay, to talk about the Passover. They just say Pascha when they're talking about Easter. And so the Jews' Passover is hand. This is how John's speaking. So to me, this is very clear evidence that there were 2 Paschas happening. One, the Jews were still celebrating the Old Testament way, and another one was the celebration of the resurrection. And so in John chapter 11, 55, it has, and the Jews' Passover was at hand. So this is also talking about the Pascha of the Jews. So it's very clear to me that there are 2 Paschas happening. And so these would have been happening at exactly the same period of time. So when Luke, so this is after the Gentiles know about the gospel and they're celebrating things, that the Gentiles probably looked at the Jews and said, well, they're celebrating this thing. And they, one of the strongest things for understanding that the Old Testament Passover became Easter is the fact they didn't change the word. It's the same word, Pascha. So the early church writers, or they call them the early church fathers, they were using this word Pascha. And so why would they do that? Obviously, because it's the same festival, but in the middle period of it, the resurrection has happened. So everything's changed for a certain group of people, the Christians. They're using the same word, and they keep celebrating this thing, but it becomes a New Testament feast. And so when we look at Tyndale, so Tyndale, he formulated the word Passover, and he was using Easter. So these sometimes, in many of the verses, that they would use Easter or Passover. And like you say, in the Bishop's Bible, they had Easter twice. In some of the other ones, they had them like 14 times. They had the word Easter. Even Tyndale called Christ our Easter Lamb, is sacrificed for us. Okay. So my whole argument is that the the way that we have it today is we have Easter clearly as a New Testament celebration and Passover clearly as an Old Testament celebration. And so when did this start? Well, I believe that this started at the end of the 86-year period from Tyndale to the 1611. And so this period, they weren't sure where to put it and how to use it. And sometimes they're using it for the Passover, sometimes for the celebration of the resurrection. But the King James translators, they put them the Easter in its correct semantic range. It just so happens to be the only place where in the narrative it's after the resurrection. If they kept this Easter place just in John somewhere randomly, John chapter 11 or something like that, it's like, well, why would they do that? Now, in the Oxford English Dictionary, it does say that this is a way that they used it. In my second article that I wrote in 2007, I talk about this, how this became an obsolete term, the word Easter, for describing the Passover. So it became an obsolete term. Now, when did it become obsolete? The Oxford English Dictionary guys, who knows who they were? I've seen an interesting movie about that. One guy was a bit of a psycho. But perhaps they were Christians, perhaps they weren't, whatever. But it's like, I wouldn't expect them to have a perfect theology with everything. And they did mention Acts chapter 12, verse 4 in that. I did look at that in my 2007 article. But I came to the conclusion that it was actually the King James translation that formulated what we have, the usage of Easter and Passover as separate words today, because they put it in its semantic range in the only narrative piece in Acts chapter 12, verse 4, after the resurrection. So they did that. I believe they did that by design. And you were talking about some of the translators still were using, Easter as an Old Testament Passover type of word. Most of the times I've been shown many of these things over the years, over the last 20 years that I've been defending Easter. And most of the time, all of the time that I can tell, they're actually quoting older works. They might be even quoting the Bishop's Bible, or they're quoting people who were before 1611. And so that's what I've found on my Facebook groups with people. They'll just throw up a whole bunch of quotes, and I'll look at them and say, they're actually quoting someone from 1589 or something. And of course, that usage was still happening. That usage pretty much died out. Now, there might be the odd spattering here and there, but it pretty much died out at after 1611, because 1611 was a definitive work. They put the words into their correct semantic range, and then English people all of a sudden went, let's use Easter in a New Testament context. Let's use Passover in an Old Testament context. And it seems like this was done by design by the King James translators. And so whether Polycarp and Anicetus, whether their comments are reliable, I think Eusebius is very reliable. He's a very reliable source of the early church. Just because we don't have the original documents or the original, I shouldn't say the original documents like the paper, but the original document, even copies of it, of that conversation that happened or the meeting that happened, doesn't mean it didn't happen. I mean, there are a lot of pieces that are actually put back together by looking at Eusebius. There are many works that people go back and they say, well, we don't have that document, but we can piece it together with what Eusebius is talking about. And sometimes Eusebius talks about things we have no idea what he's actually talking about, except for what he himself says. And so, but when we do find those documents, they're reliable. And so I don't think we should really question Eusebius there. And so how much time do I have there, Donny?
You've got about 20 seconds, Nick.
Okay, so I think I'll just leave it there.
Okay, Nick, I appreciate that 8-minute rebuttal. Gentlemen, that concludes the opening statements, 15 minutes, and the rebuttals, 8 minutes. Lots of points on the table for us to engage and to discuss. We're entering the 50-minute discussion portion. Reminder to the audience, if you do have questions for the debaters, Nick Sayers and TurretinFan, please tag me. Let's try and keep it on topic as much as possible. Is Easter the wrong translation? So since Nick Sayers just ended with his 8-minute rebuttal, Turretin, why don't we give you the first 25 minutes for cross-examination? And so whenever you're ready, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Thanks for your presentation, Nick. I appreciate them. I always enjoy listening to your materials, so this feels very familiar. For my first question for you is, you said it's been the same usage in Greek for 2,000 years. When can you provide us with an early example of usage that clearly refers to the celebration of a resurrection day as opposed to the Passover?
Even just a cursory look at the Easter controversies. The Easter controversies were written, this is one of the biggest topics in the early church. And so even the fact that they're called the Easter controversies shows that is the usage. So historians after 1611, when they were going back and translating a lot of the works that were done in the early church, they would make that distinction. Oh, they're talking about the Passover in context here. Oh, no, they're talking about the resurrection celebration in context here. So they would translate it as Passover or Easter accordingly. And so if you're fluent in Greek and you read through those, you can see in the context what is referring to Easter and what's referring to Passover. And this is what a lot of church historians like Philip Schaff, he was part of the Revised Version Committee. I don't agree with him. Great historian, and he did that in his works.
So Eusebius is an example of someone whose works are translated with Pascha translated as Easter. But are you aware of anyone? Can you name anyone or identify any writing that has a similar translation by any of these reputable translators that you mentioned?
Not right in front of me, and so I would just say it's the biggest topic that they talked about, and so it's almost like it's sort of like stating the obvious in a sense where it's so clear that they used Easter or Pascha just for Passover and for Easter the same way that they do today. It's almost to try and prove that with evidence. It's like I'm not sure why I would have to do that. Yeah.
Fair enough. You mentioned that John uses the phrase the Jews' Passover, but I think you would agree with me that Luke, in the 7 other times when he uses Pascha, never qualifies it as the Jews' Pascha. Correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So the fact that he doesn't qualify it that way here isn't particularly noteworthy.
I guess it could depend on when Luke was written, but John certainly went out of his way to say it was the Jews' Passover. So I guess Luke not saying that, maybe after a while it didn't need to be said. Maybe John was writing at a time when they had to make that clear distinction. And so, yeah.
You made a statement, and I didn't quite transcribe what you argued, so maybe you can clarify it for me. You said that the early church fathers or early Christian writers used the word Pascha, and it sounded like you said because it's the same thing or the same feast or something like that. Could you clarify that point that you were making?
Yes, so it was exactly this. It's basically the Passover became Easter. It's not like Easter just sort of popped out of nowhere. There was already celebrations happening, but Christians were involved in these celebrations in the early church, specifically the Jewish Christians. And then when the Gentiles became believers, they adopted that celebration as well. And so it just became called Pascha by everyone because it was exactly the same week. It's just that the Christians they're both looking at the same coin, the word Pascha, but one means resurrection for the Christians and one means the old covenant type for the Jews.
If Luke shared your view of that, and he used the same word in both places, in both for the Passover that refers to the Old Testament Passover and for a New Testament celebration, if he was using the same Greek word for both, why shouldn't we just use the same English word? Why do we need to do something more or better than Luke did?
I think the translators were put into a situation where Tyndale had invented the word Passover. Now, most other languages, they only have one word for both the Passover and for the celebration of the resurrection, just like it is in Greek. And they have to have the qualifying Hebrew, the Jewish the Jewish Pascha and things like that. Where in English we have these two words. Are we just going to throw one out, or what are we going to do? And so, rather than just sort of making it robotic and just keeping it Passover all the way through, they understood that this was after the resurrection. The Christians would have been celebrating this, and the King James translators believe that the early church, and many church historians believe this, the early church were practicing Easter. They were practicing a celebration of the resurrection, and so they felt like this was a word that had a lot of English history behind it as well, and especially with relating to the word resurrection, or Oster or Auferstehung in German. This was a word that was very appropriate in Acts chapter 12, verse 4.
So English has the availability of multiple words, but the word Pascha in Greek is already just a made-up word. So what if you can make up words and just transliterate and so forth, what's the need to have two separate words in English rather than just having one word in English that would unite these two feasts? Instead of suggesting that they're two different things, they suggest they are one and the same. Just as you said, I think you just argued that it's the same, that Passover became this new thing, and the Christians called it. All the Christians were calling it the same name. But now, 1,600 years later, almost, the King James translators are insisting on using a different word for the same thing that for centuries, people in all the other tongues and languages on the planet, including the Greeks, are using the same word. What's the rationale?
Well, if you were a Greek speaker and you saw Pascha means Easter, if you read Acts chapter 12, verse 4 and went, well, this is the church, this is the era of the apostles, the Acts of the apostles, you would read it and go, well, that means Easter. And so they were just faithful to that, because we had these two words. We had the new word of Passover, and we had the older word of Easter. And so they were just faithful to do, the Greeks read it that way. And the early church, that's the usage that they had, was to go, Pascha means Easter. And so,
If the King James translators created a new rule for English, a fine distinction between Easter and Passover, that 86 years after Tyndale coined the word, then why did Lancelot Andrewes break that rule in 1618 during his sermon to King James at Easter?
Well, that would have to be looked at in context. I've had people give me a whole list of places where people after 1611 have used the word in that context, talking about the Jewish Passover. And like I said, a lot of the time, every time that I've looked at, they are quoting things from before the translation. They might be saying, well, Calvin said it this way, or some other guy said it this other way. And so that they're talking about the back in the old usage. Now, I'm not saying that there's quotes that I don't know about, and I wouldn't be as strict to say at 1611, there was some rule that you can't ever use it that way. And these guys, many of them were older, and they would have been having that usage right up until they worked on the translation. And so,
So for your background, in 1618, the Archbishop of Canterbury suggested we have no such tradition verse as the verse to be read on Easter Day and to be preached on, presumably because of Puritan tendencies. And therefore, Lancelot Andrewes started his sermon with the statement, "This is no Easter text as we are wont to have. Nothing of the resurrection is in it. It is not for the day." Does that ring a bell, or are you not familiar with that? sermon.
It doesn't ring a bell just off the top of my head. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll come down to just the portion that's the part that I'm referring to. He says, "And last, by the never broken custom of a solemn Eucharist, ever upon this day, Origen in his 7th upon Exodus, he says, our Easter day far passes the Jewish Easter. They had no manna on theirs. The Passover was eaten in Egypt. Manna came not till they were in the wilderness. But we, says he, we never keep our Passover, but we are sure of manna upon it, the true manna, the bread of life that came down from heaven. For they had no Easter then without a communion." So do you hear him using it in that context?
Yeah. So as I said, he's quoting Origen. So he would be quoting an early church writer that's been translated probably before 1611. And so I'm actually familiar with that one. I think it was Brett Biggs. He brought that up to me. And he's quoting Origen saying that. So that would be part of the early church writings that were translated probably in the Reformation period sometime.
So Lancelot Andrus knew like 21 languages, including Greek. He was fluent in it. Why in the world would he be relying on an English translation that came before him?
Well, probably for his audience. They would have been familiar with this type of work. And so he wants to quote it verbatim from that book or whatever. And so that's how they would have grown up with it. That's how they would have used it. And so, yeah.
Are you quite sure that there was actually an English translation of Origen's work at that time?
I think I did look that up, but I was given a list of about 20 places that were like this. And as I mentioned, they were usually quotations of someone speaking. And so I find that was just a trend that most of these places were like that.
If this were a rule, then why did English theologians such as John Lightfoot, Richard Baxter, Matthew Henry, and John Gill, all born in the 1600s, all growing up under the King James Version, why did they all say that this word means or should be Passover?
Most of these guys actually started to talk about Easter being a pagan festival. So that was one of the reasons why a lot of people they shied away from the word Easter, because they started. I thought it started from Alexander Hislop. So in my first article, I talked about that in 2005. But as I've gone through the years, I've realized that there were people just after 50 years after the translation, they were talking about this being a pagan festival, and the Puritans saying, we don't want anything to do with this word. It's a pagan festival. We don't want to celebrate Christmas or Easter. They wanted to ban the whole celebration of Easter. And so I still get that type of opposition from some people in the Reformed camp today.
So you're suggesting that Lightfoot's commentary on Acts was he was motivated by his kind of puritanical or Reformed leanings to misinterpret the scriptures on this point?
I guess it just depends. Say people like James White have been influenced that it's a pagan festival, and he's like, well, that's why it's an error in the King James. I mean, even people who I would respect, D.A. Waite, Jack Mormon, interesting guys within the Texas Receptus camp. They both believed that it was a pagan festival as well, until I showed them my material, and that they both turned and changed to my position. And so, yeah, I would just say he was just probably poorly influenced in this area.
And Richard Baxter the same, and Matthew Henry the same, and John Gill the same. They're all just poor. They're not scholars of the first water. They're just influenced by bad scholarship about Easter.
I would say that some of them were influenced by the pagan myth. Others, they were because there is the Brian Ross understanding of Easter being still under that definition that Tyndale started and had up until about the time of the King James translators. that Easter meant the Jewish Passover as well. And so some of those guys, they wanted to hang on to that. Some of them rejected the King James, and they went to the bishops, they went to the Geneva, and they felt the King James wasn't good. And so they were oftentimes personally reading that and coming to those conclusions.
If this was a rule of English, how come the 1911 Oxford English Dictionary, which I've heard you cite before on things like unicorn, how is it that they placed in their usage notes under the second definition of Easter as the Jewish Passover obsolete? Why did they list the 1611 Bible Acts 12:4 as an example of the word Easter meaning the Jewish Passover?
I think because, just like I would say to someone like Brian Ross, that's what he sees, that Acts chapter 12 verse 4 was still under that definition where Easter meant the Jewish Passover. But for me, Easter is one of those words which, if you look up nearly every dictionary, you and I both know it's not a pagan festival. And most of what I've heard you say is that you reject that notion. And so we understand that these dictionaries can be wrong on these themes at times where they're talking about Easter. They're wrong saying it's a pagan festival. And so for me, this slight detail of having Acts chapter 12, verse 4 as an example there is they're just wrong. And that's what I would say.
Among the theologians that I mean, let me pause here for a second. None of the King James translators ever claimed that they did this intentionally or that they meant to set up a new English usage or anything like that, correct?
I don't know of them coming out and saying, hey, we've changed Easter specifically to match what we see today, and or it's going to be a future thing that happens, or no.
And then among any theologians in the next 300 years, that's from 1611 to 1911, when the Oxford English Dictionary came out, in that window, is any theologian saying that Acts 12:4 here refers to the resurrection day? Or is everybody agreeing with me that it's referring to the Passover?
Well, I think for most people, if I was to ask the average person on the street, what is Easter? They'd say, oh, well, it's a celebration of the Christian resurrection. That's the definition that people would have. When did that start? I believe it started around the time of 1611. It became a cultural thing in England, and the King James translators, they put that into the scriptures. Even the prefatory notes in the King James have to find Easter forever. That they don't have anything to do with Passover using the word Easter. And so I think it just became more and more popular, and they use that word.
We mentioned that the Geneva Bible completely eradicated the use of Easter, including at Acts 12:4, starting in, I think it was the 1560, and then all the other editions of the Geneva Bible after that. Were they also influenced by some wrong idea about Ishtar or one of these other notions? Or what was the reason that they translated it as Passover there instead of putting Easter?
I would just say it was probably because it was translated outside of England, perhaps, it being the Geneva Bible, influenced by people in Europe. There's a lot of where am I going with this? So I would just say that they could have easily just used Easter in every place. They could have used Passover in every place. It was just something that they became synonyms during that time. And for their particular translation, I don't know why they did that. In the 1557 edition of the Geneva Bible, it's exactly the same as the King James, where they had it once in Acts chapter 12, verse 4. So there could have been people who were against that word being included, thinking that it's related to the earlier Church of England, and some of the religious baggage that it had there. I'm not really sure why they did what they did.
Tyndale did his translation work where?
In Germany.
Outside of England. And he was influenced in his word choice of Passover by some Europeans, right?
Yeah.
So that's not a indicia of unreliability. In fact, Geneva is a place where lots of people who were victims of persecution by the Church of England went, correct?
Yeah, it just depends on certain timing, because Tyndale also used the word congregation. He didn't want to use the word church. But then by 1611, the word church had become a good word because the churches weren't all Catholic and weren't persecuting everyone, and all that sort of sense. So I'm not really sure how the English translators, when they were in Geneva, what their view of what Easter was. It could have been that it's all a Catholic thing or whatever, or it's just a traditional thing. I'm not really sure,
All right. I'm trying to think if there's any points I haven't covered so far. I think we've had very focused answers, and I appreciate that. Just trying to see if there's any other points you raised that I would want to clarify. You mentioned Henry Saville, and the fact that he wrote about, or he published Chrysostom's works, going through many manuscripts as a treasure to the church. What does that have to do with this debate? Is it because Chrysostom was interested in the Quartodeciman controversy?
I think in my second article, written in 2007, I sum this up. That if one was to search the biographies of Christian history to select a person equipped to translate Acts chapter 12, verse 4 into English from Greek, it would be hard to discover someone more able than Saville. Obsessed with Chrysostom, an enemy of Quartodecimanism, Saville was intimately acquainted with the Easter controversy, and also in the original languages of Greek. He was a noted mathematician with a mind for detail and chronological events, and one of the greatest English Greek scholars who personally tutored the Queen of England. And so he also, with that work of Chrysostom, he used Lancelot Andrewes and John Boyce and George Abbott, I'm pretty sure. So they all worked on that. So they would have had to make the distinction between what the Passover is and what Easter is. So this was a huge issue in Chrysostom's work. So that's why I pointed that out, that he worked on it and he knew all about these Easter controversies.
So when we say the controversy, as you said, was because there was people celebrating a feast that was called Pascha, and some people were celebrating it sometime, some people were celebrating it at another time. And if we're talking about the time of Chrysostom, that's the late 300s, I believe, approximately. So how would we go from people celebrating a feast at different times back to this being an apostolic era tradition?
Well, I think if you just look at the usage of the word, say by the time of Chrysostom, they're using the word Pascha for Easter everywhere. Everyone's using that. And they're not debating whether to celebrate Easter. They're debating on what day to do it on. So all the Christians are doing it. And when you go back through Eusebius, when you go back to the quotations of, up till 150 or 120, as I brought it earlier, you see that they're using these same words, the word Pascha for Easter all the way through. So to make that leap to Acts chapter 12, verse 4 is not a huge leap from those early church writings to translate that as Easter.
I guess a related question would be this. the Council of Nicaea said, among other things, it wasn't the main focus maybe, but one of the things that it said is, we're all going to celebrate it at the same time as the Romans celebrate it. But then the Council of Antioch in 341, so that's almost 20 years later, they're calling for the excommunication of people who are not following that decision. If this is just a matter of what day we celebrate it, why are there people resisting to the point of excommunication?
And gentlemen, we're going to have to make that the final question. Nick, take your time to respond. And then we are going to transition into the second 25-minute cross-examination where, Nick, you get to lead the way.
So just answering that final question, Paul was very clear on this issue. He said in Romans chapter 14, he said, one man esteems one day above another, another esteems every day alike. Let each man be fully persuaded in his own mind. He that regards the day regards it to the Lord. He that does not regard the day to the Lord, he does not regard it. But who are you to judge your brother, or why do you show contempt for your brother? We shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. So the quartodeciman issue, that was people were saying you had to do it on the 14th, the same day as Passover. And so that was a bit like the Seventh-day Adventists saying you have to keep the Sabbath sort of thing. It became a strict thing that was legalism, and it was causing people to stumble because most of the church weren't doing this. So they would go around and say, you have to keep the 14th. And then, of course, within these Christian groups, they started persecuting these people, even killing them, the people who celebrated the 14th. And so that's why that was an issue there.
Nick and Turretin, thank you very much for that first 25-minute cross-exam. Very easy to mod. Appreciate you both keeping it professional and on point and on topic. Very good. Okay, so we're entering the second 25-minute cross-exam. I will restart the timer. And Nick, whenever you're ready, you can start.
Thanks, Donny. So Turretin, why would John have in John chapter 2, verse 13, for example, and the Jews' Passover was at hand? So in the Greek, it's the Pascha. He specifically has that, the Jewish Pascha. So if you were writing the gospel, why would you specifically make it the Jews' Pascha?
Well, I think the reason that John did that is because John was writing to people who are not familiar with Jewish customs. That's why he uses this phrase multiple times throughout his gospel, not just here, but for example, in John 2, there were 6 water pots of stone. This is verse 6, after the manner of the purifying of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. So he's describing this water pots that are part of the Jewish rituals because his readers are not familiar with Jewish rituals.
Okay. Couldn't that be because there are 2 Paschas happening?
It would be surprising if John's readers were familiar with both Jewish and Christian customs, and yet such that they might confuse which Pascha we're talking about, but they're not familiar with the Jewish ritual washing or the day of preparation of the Jews, as John says in another place.
Okay. So what is, so if you were in Greece today and you said, happy Pascha to someone, how would they understand that?
Well, if you said Kalo Pascha, I'm not sure if that's the right way to pronounce it, but if you say that to them, they probably interpret it as Happy Easter because it's primarily a Christian country, at least by profession, these days. So they probably understand it in the way that it's widely used today in Greece, which is a reference to the resurrection, which I think for them, unless they've adopted the Roman calendar, is next week or next Sunday.
Okay, so if you were to go back in the Byzantine era, say about 1200, and go up to all the priests and say Kalapascha, what would they think that meant?
Probably the same thing in 1200. Yeah.
Okay, so if you were to go back to the time of Chrysostom and talk to them and say Kalapascha, what would they think that it meant?
So they would probably think, if you're in a Christian context, they would probably think you meant the celebration of Christ's resurrection, I think. But of course, if they suspected you of being a Quartodeciman, they might say you're a Judaizer and accuse you of celebrating a Jewish feast. So there's maybe some ambiguity in the expression then, because of these various different groups that celebrated at different times, either on a fixed day of the year or at the time when the Jews celebrated, etc.
Okay, so why would it be such a big leap to go to Acts chapter 12 and where it has Pascha there and not translate it as Easter?
It would be a big jump to go from the end of the 2nd or 3rd century, when when various customs began to develop in the churches, and especially when we see people like Melito of Sardis writing in treatise called On Pascha and not mentioning a celebration of the resurrection, or Origen writing the same thing and not mentioning a celebration of the resurrection. That when you see that those things are not appearing in the early layers of the Christian writings, to assume that what has always been, or that what is now in the Middle Ages has always been, is just to commit the same kind of anachronism that people in the Middle Ages all too often did. They assumed that there was a bishop of Rome always, all the way back to the 1st century. And people like Eusebius bought those ideas, even though that's not correct.
But wouldn't you say that in some of those works that are specifically talking about the Passover, that once they have defined their term, they don't have to have the accompanying word Jewish Pascha on there? They can just talk about the Pascha and people will know what they're talking about.
I suppose that's a fair point. In this case, Luke wrote Luke and Acts, and in Luke 22:1, he defined what Pascha means, which is the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
Okay, and so would you, I know that, listening to your videos, you've talked about Luke and brought up Luke constantly, saying, well, he says the Passover is defined by Luke. Luke says, it's the feast of the Passover and all that sort of stuff. But wouldn't you say that the Christians, after the resurrection, I know that the Greeks used the same word, but the King James translators are having these two words. Clearly, this festival was something that happened in the early church. So do you think that it happened in the early church, or do you, like that Easter? When would you say Easter first happened?
The celebration of the resurrection of Jesus Christ happened every week among the Christians, not an annual feast, but and Eusebius actually says this on his treatise on the Passover. He mentions that we celebrate Christ's resurrection every week. And for him, the Easter day, this special celebration, was just the first in a series of weekly celebrations of the resurrection of Christ. Now that apostolic tradition goes all the way back. We actually see that recorded in the New Testament, that they gathered together on the first day of the week.
Okay, but specifically the Pascha, and that, so basically we have the Jews celebrating the Pascha for a long time. Then the Christians come on board, and then according to my examination, from 120, all of the churches are doing it. They're all doing this Pascha thing. So would you say that that is true, that all the Christians, maybe there might have been a spattering of people who were against it or whatever for some reason, but pretty much all the Christians were celebrating a Pascha?
I think your 120 date is off. I think if you look at the dates for Anicetus, that he would need to be much later, at least like 30 years later, if that even happened. And I question whether that meeting ever happened or if that's a bit of kind of historical fiction. And so I don't accept the idea that it was already widespread in 120. So, and I think it's hard to establish that from any historical records that we have now. And, hoping that Eusebius was relying on something accurate is problematic because, for example, he did rely on Irenaeus, and Irenaeus is one of the people who claims that apostolic tradition said that Jesus was almost 50 or around 50 when he died, when he was really in his 30s.
Yeah, and like I understand that there are certain people who had certain strange concepts that he parroted and talked about and said, I think it was like Judas, he lived and had these long arms and all sorts of strange things. But I guess from that time we see, like, even in 150, we see, I'm just looking at the quotation here that I've got. Well, this is Eusebius as well. And he talks about in 150, I'll just grab that, won't be 1 second. So in Eusebius, it says, a question of no small importance arose about that time. And so he's talking about 190 in all the dioceses of Asia, and he talks about the Quartodeciman issue. And then it says, a letter of Irenaeus is among the extracts just referred to. Actually, I might be reading a quote, so I'm really sorry about that. I thought it was just Eusebius's writings there. But so where do I go from there? When would you say that Easter first started?
So, again, as a church feast dedicated to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, my best guess, based on the evidence we have, is the end of the 2nd century or the beginning of the 3rd century that it began to catch on. Which church first tried it out, I don't know. But they were celebrating Christ's resurrection every Sunday since the time of the apostles. That's an actual apostolic tradition. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but that specifically wouldn't be called the Pascha.
Well, the many early church writers pointed out that the Lord's Supper is the Pascha. So it depends what you mean when you say Pascha.
Okay, well, there's only really 2 definitions of the Pascha, and that's the Passover or Easter. And it might, it's a polyseme. It can mean, the Passover lamb. It can mean the Passover day. They sacrifice a lamb. It can mean a whole bunch of different things. But in history, usually they're using it as talking about the feast of the Passover or the feast of the Christians, which is Easter.
So I'm pointing to, on the celebration of the Pascha, section 7 from Eusebius of Caesarea, the same Eusebius we're talking about. And there he says, for this reason, we celebrate the festival of our Pascha every week on the day of our Savior and Lord, carrying out the mysteries of the true Lamb by whom we have been ransomed. And the word mysteries there is his word for the Lord's Supper. Okay,
well, that's a really good quote. And so I would say that's a very interesting thing that I'll have to look into. So what would your take be on someone like Philip Schaff, who says that the Easter festival, he says the paschal controversies of the 2nd century related not to the fact, but to the time of the Easter festival. And Polycarp of Smyrna and Anicet of Rome trace their customs to a practice of the apostles themselves. So Philip Schaff was, one of the bobbing heads here. What would you say to Philip? So he worked on the Revised Version, was contemporary with Westcott and Hort, but he was a very good church historian. I don't agree with his text criticism. So what would you say to him?
So my question for him, were he here, would be, if it was an apostolic tradition, if it was actually an apostolic tradition and not just an alleged apostolic tradition, shouldn't it be on the same day so Lancelot Andrewes agreed with what Schaff is saying. Obviously, Lancelot Andrewes came first, not Schaff. But Lancelot Andrewes says, well, one of these traditions was started by Peter, the other tradition was started by John. But why would the apostles, by divine authority, appoint 2 different days? It doesn't make any sense. Once you start thinking that through, you realize, no, actually, the Quartodecimans and the Contras of the time both tried to assert that they had apostolic authority for what they were doing. And somebody like Eusebius is recording the debate that followed from that. And it lasted into the 300s. As you said, it did seem to start towards the end of the 2nd century, but it lasted a long time. And people fought very fiercely on this point.
Okay, so just another quote by Schaff. He says, Easter is the resurrection festival, which follows the Passover proper, but is included in the same festive week. And so would you agree that in the early period of Easter, that was happening exactly the same time as Passover?
Well, there's a big debate, as you just highlighted by the Quartodeciman controversy, about who was the first group to start celebrating this feast of Pascha among Christians. And if you're talking about the ones who are celebrating the feast of Pascha on the day of Passover, on the 14th of Nisan, or Abib, if you use the older name, but if you're talking about those people, that wouldn't be within the week. It would be on the first day of the week. The first day of the Passover week. And if you're talking about the ones that celebrated it on the next Lord's Day after the Passover, then that would be within that definition that you just described, I believe.
Okay, so my understanding of it is that they were all celebrating exactly the same days, but some finished, they used to fast before this. So some finished the fast on the 14th, and others finished the fast on the Sunday after the 14th. But all of those days were a celebration.
Oh, I think you might find that would be a little bit of a mistake in the mentality that they had. It's either a feast day or a fast day, but not both.
Okay. So I think this was one of the reasons why. I'll just find this. So Eusebius again, he says, some held that the 14th day of the moon on which the Jews were commanded to sacrifice a lamb should always be observed as the life-giving Pasch, contending that the fast ought to end on that day, whatever day of the week it might happen to be. So it can fall on a Tuesday, it can fall on a Friday, whatever. However, it was not the custom of the churches in the rest of the world to end it at that point. So it was a minority view. As they observed the practice which from apostolic tradition has prevailed to the present time of terminating the fast on no other day than on that which is the resurrection of our Savior. So talking about the Sunday afterwards, or the Sunday representing that. So some would be fasting and some wouldn't be. And so that's why it was such a contentious controversy. Because you're there with people who are eating and other people, they're still fasting. And so, but to me, this is happening in the same week of time. It's happening at exactly the same time.
So this would typically have been, if I recall correctly, the way that the churches were organized at that time. Everything was ruled by bishops, and then there were larger metropolitans in regions and so forth. But the bishop would have, in a specific area, would have dictated how the Lenten fast was observed. But the idea that the Lenten fast goes all the way back to the apostles is absurd. It's not true. There was not a Lenten fast among the apostles, and we know that because of Jesus' own teaching about the nature of fasting, and the and Paul the Apostle's teaching on fasting as well. That those later traditions of mandatory Lenten fasting are not apostolic. They're very early, but they're not apostolic.
Yeah, and so I guess I'm not saying the fasting part is apostolic. I'm just reading Eusebius there. So that's what he was saying.
I understand.
Was happening. So he said the fast, some broke the fast on the 14th, some broke it on the Sunday after. But I guess it's just like with our Easter today, we got, Good Friday, Saturday, and then a Sunday, where I believe Jesus died on a Thursday. So that would be different to, the Roman Catholic understanding, and also a lot of Protestant churches believe that as well. But I do celebrate the resurrection on the Sunday, and so some people they celebrated. They had, in a sense, the feast day, and I think this would have played in with the Jewish group, because they were having the Passover feast on the 14th. So to me, it's sort of like people were compromising with the Jews, and they're like, oh, well, let's not rock the boat. Let's just do it on the 14th like they're doing it. Where the Christians were like, no, let's wait until the resurrection day after that. And so that's my understanding of it anyway. So.
Well, it is interesting if you are looking at the geographic dispersion of the people who celebrated on different days. The Quartodecimans were the people around Jerusalem and the other places that were close to where the apostles lived, and the Western folks, like the Romans and other Western folks, are the ones who were doing it on a Sunday, always on a Sunday, and that's the side that ended up winning that debate. But does that have anything to do with the apostles? I think the short answer is no. It's just a very early human tradition. It's not an apostolic tradition. And the link to Lent should be an indication of that. Eusebius was wrong. It was not an apostolic tradition.
Okay, so John Owen, he wrote this. He said there was also a signal vindication of truth pleaded for in an instance of fact among the primitive churches. There was an opinion which prevailed very early among them about the necessary observation of Easter in the room of the Jewish Passover, for the solemn commemoration of the death and resurrection of our Saviour. It was taken for granted by most of them that the observance hereof was countenanced, so that the Passover became Easter, if not rendered necessary to them by the example of the apostles. For they generally believed that by them it was observed, and that it was their duty to accommodate themselves to their practice. By the later 2nd century, it was accepted that the celebration of Easter was the practice of the disciples, and an undisputed tradition that Easter was to be observed by virtue of apostolic tradition was generally granted by all. So with this understanding of John Owen, we can clearly see that this would have been the mindset of probably the King James translators or people around that Reformation and post-Reformation era. So they would have seen that the early church practiced Easter. So understanding that Acts chapter 12, verse 4 is Pascha there, would you, what would your answer be to John Owen on this quote here?
So John Owen didn't believe that the apostles appointed this. I don't know if you're suggesting that he thought that they did, but he did not believe that. He's referring to some, like as an example, he says, and this is a quotation from his Truth and Innocence Vindicated in a survey of a discourse concerning ecclesiastical polity and the authority of the civil magistrate over the consciences of subjects in matters of religion. It's found in his works. He says, those from the Church in the New Testament had either a perpetual binding institution from the authority of Christ as the Lord's Day Sabbath, or contain only a direction to use civil customs and observances in a holy and sanctified manner, as the love feasts and kiss of charity, or such as were never heard of in the New Testament at all, as the observation of Lent and Easter. So that's what John Owen thought, and I agree with him on that point.
Okay, so I guess that would come down to us. We would have to look at when John Owen used those quotations. Perhaps he changed his mind. Either way, perhaps one was written earlier in his life and one was written later, and so that would be something, because they are contradictory statements. Here he's saying Easter was. That Easter was to be observed by virtue of apostolical tradition was generally granted by all. So he's saying that pretty much everyone was celebrating Easter. So that would have to be something that would be looked at. But I appreciate that quote that you've got there.
I think the way to harmonize them is to say he's not saying he agrees that it was of apostolic tradition, just that in the 3rd century or in the late 2nd century, that people believed that, and widely this idea came to be that many people thought it was of apostolic authority. I think that's all he's saying in the quotation you provided. As I don't have the rest of the context in front of me, I'm not 100% sure. But I think that would be an easy way to kind of fit them together. He's saying, no, some of the early church had very wrong ideas.
And that would make sense because I think it was Polycarp who said he got it from John, the date. So Polycarp was saying that he got it from John on the 14th. And so he's saying that he got it from apostolic tradition, from John. And so...
I think the answer to that is that Eusebius, I believe, is the one who says, and again, Eusebius is much later and believes these stories, but Eusebius says that Irenaeus says that event happened. But I don't think we have any, none of the writings of Polycarp mention that. None of the ones we have, which is, I think, maybe 1 or 2 documents, neither of those happen to mention this. We don't have any actual writing from Polycarp about that.
Okay, so I guess in a way I would have to get you to agree with those. I guess I would have to do my homework a little bit on Eusebius's quotation and make that, find some more information on that or some more documents or something that would back up and verify Eusebius's quotation there.
Fair enough.
Nick, if you wanted one final question, and then we are going to wrap up the discussion.
Okay. So I think I'm all out of questions there, Donny.
Okay.
I think I'm done.
It was a comprehensive 50-minute cross exam. Great job to the both of you. It was a very specific topic in question: is Easter the wrong translation? And so I think you both did an excellent job asking the relevant questions, the important questions. And I truly believe what we have here is another go-to debate on a topic that it's a hot topic. It's a controversial topic. But people on both sides of the issue, if they're looking for a comprehensive debate and discussion to kind of help them make that objective decision on where they stand, this is a fantastic debate to watch. So I do want to encourage those in the audience to share this around. The truth is important. Critical thinking is important. A couple people in the chat saying 2 hours already. That was my thoughts, gentlemen. I was sitting back enjoying the discussion, and I looked over at the timer, and I thought 24 minutes already for that last cross exam. Okay, so with that, we are going to jump into 5-minute concluding statements. TurretinFan, you are the affirmative tonight, so you get the first 5 minutes. Whenever you're ready, just let me know, and I'll start your timer.
I'm ready. Thanks very much, Donny. But also thanks, Nick, for your interaction in this debate and for the very professional cross-examination sections. I appreciate the King James Version. It's the version I use as my primary version in English, as I've mentioned in previous debates, and I've evidenced through my blog and YouTube channel. That said, I think there are some places where it can be improved, and this is one of those places, because the word Easter does not accurately reflect what Luke wrote. He wrote Pascha. Pascha meant Passover. Every previous time it had been written before Luke wrote Acts 12:4. And in all the documents we can find today, at least until the 2nd century, it always meant Passover in all of those documents as well. So we can't find any documents where it doesn't mean that. In fact, when we look at the King James translators, they lived in a time when the word Easter as a term for Passover had some residual usage. We saw that in Lancelot Andrews. We saw that residual usage in a few places, but that residual usage would explain why they didn't correct Acts 12:4 and use Passover. It's possible they just didn't notice it. We were told some speculation about that maybe they were carefully considering this and skillfully crafting things. They don't say that. They didn't tell us that. They just didn't change the Bishop's Bible on that point. They inherited it, but they didn't change it. Should they have? Yes. It would have been more clear to us today had they done so. Was it a wrong translation when Tyndale made it? Absolutely not. When Tyndale made it, it was the word for Passover. So over time, the rest of the New Testament was updated, and this one should have been updated as well. And it has been updated by most other translations, although a few use some other option like Pascha, but almost all put Passover. In fact, the Geneva Bible started doing that in 1560, again in 1595 and 1599, translating from Beza's New Testament. They translated into English, and you could see who is the translator. Thompson, I think, was one in 1595. In any event, they're reliable translators. They did a good job, and in this case, they got it correct. The idea that this word means the Feast of the Resurrection is an idea that we didn't see any support of. In other words, we saw this only based on speculation about the fact that it's an event that occurred after Jesus' resurrection. But in terms of what the King James translators meant and that intent, we don't see any 1600s authors saying that that's what it meant. In fact, we see just the opposite. All the major authors, all the major English theologians from the 1600s, John Lightfoot in his commentary on Acts, Richard Baxter, Matthew Henry, who wrote a commentary on the whole Bible, John Gill, who did the same, all born in the 1600s, all agree that this word either should be Passover or means Passover. And if you go for 300 years and you look at the Oxford English Dictionary in 1911, they agree that it should mean that. If we look at all the lexicons, they agree that it means Passover. The weight of the evidence is heavily against the idea that it means Easter. And the fact that modern Greeks use the word that way, I suppose, is the strongest argument in favor, but modern Greek has adopted that meaning because starting in the late 2nd century or early 3rd century, Christians started to celebrate the resurrection using the name Pascha, which was borrowed from the Jewish celebration of Passover, also and the original Pascha. So that transformed the meaning of the word. The fact that two things are now have the same name, eventually, among the Greeks, the Christian celebration became the dominant one. So although from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd century AD, the entire window around Luke's writing, it always means Passover. Yes, in 1200, in 400, in the late 300s even, it will almost certainly be understood among Christians as referring to a celebration of the resurrection. But did it have apostolic authority? Was that what the early Christians were doing? The answer there is, again, no. There's no historical evidence to support that, unlike celebrating the Lord's Supper regularly or meeting on the first day of the week to celebrate Christ's resurrection in that way.
Okay, TurretinFan, thank you very much for that roughly 5-minute concluding statement. Nick, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. You also have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Donny. So I would disagree that Eusebius is just wrong here. I would think that a church historian like Eusebius, he was stating something that was happening. Some of these things are so vast that it's almost we can get bogged down in looking at the trees and not see the forest. Like, say, for example, the fact that the church used the word Pascha, which is exactly the same word for Passover. They just use this word Pascha. It's the same word. And so that would tell us that there was a carryover. They didn't all of a sudden go, hey, let's just celebrate this thing and we'll call it something different. Because it continued on. It was the Pesach of the Jews that went into the early Jewish church. And then when the Gentiles came into the church, they were celebrating it too. They were calling it the Pascha. And so that just continued on into the early church. And so the early church usage is that they use Pascha for Easter. They used to say the Jewish Pascha if they were talking about the Passover. So they had these two different concepts. Now, that was the same in the Byzantine era. That was the same in Greek in the time of 1611. That's the same in Greek today. So to me, it's very clear that this is a word that's been used for both Passover and for Easter, depending on the semantic range of the word. So in Acts chapter 12, verse 4, that is the only place that is warranted to have the word Easter because it is after the resurrection. So after the resurrection of Jesus, everything changed. The shadows and types became redundant. It says that in the book of Hebrews, these are shadows, these are types. They're not the fulfillment. The fulfillment is Christ. He is the Passover lamb that takes away the sin of the world. And so they're celebrating a Pascha that is to do with the resurrection of Christ and not just what Moses instituted. And so the King James translators, fluent in Greek, understanding the early church writings, understanding the Easter controversies of the early church, and knowing many different languages, people like Henry Saville, people like Lancelot Andrews, they looked at this and they said, let's put Acts chapter 4, let's put Easter in Acts chapter 4, verse 12, just in that one place, because that is the only place where it's warranted in a post-resurrection narrative. And so everywhere the other 28 times is talking about the Old Testament feast. This one place is the only place after the resurrection. There are many people like Philip Schaff. We're looking at people like Messianic Jews like Alfred Erdeshim. He said that it was the old Pascha and the first, or rather symbol of promise of the new. So we're talking about that the Pascha that the Christians were celebrating was something that was it was a celebration of the early church of the resurrection. It wasn't like, okay, we're going to just kill the lamb, we're going to go through the old law again. No, it was something that, and it developed through time. Once the Gentiles were brought in, they obviously wouldn't have been killing the Passover lambs and had this tradition. And so that's why John clearly said it's the Jews' Passover, the Jews' Pascha, because he wanted to make a distinction between what the Jews were doing and what the Christians were doing with their Pascha. So I believe that speaks volumes to us as well. So historians like Philip Schaff, he says that the early church, they were practicing their Easter according to what the apostles had given them, and the disciples were most probably celebrating Easter as well. And so I think Eusebius, talking about these things, yes, we need to study these things more and more, but I don't think we can just completely dismiss Eusebius and just push it back to the early 200s or something like that. I think we really should look at what he's saying in 120 AD, that this was something that the whole entire church was doing. So is there an error in the King James here? I don't think so. I think there's enough evidence to show that this word that means resurrection, it's related to the German word Oster and Auferstehung, which means resurrection. It's a very powerful word. It's our own distinct English word. We have two words, one for the old, one for the new. The King James translators use this. And then it just so happened after they used that usage has just spread to what we have today, two different festivals, one for the old and one for the new. So I think it fits perfectly, even with what we have today in our usage.
Okay, Nick, thank you very much for that 5-minute concluding statement. Again, excellent debate, TurretinFan and Nick. To anybody in the audience who loves this topic as much as I do, the Bible translation, textual criticism topic in general, please do check the description box of this video. I have a playlist titled King James Only Debates or Bible Translation Debates hosted by Sayers and TurretinFan Ministries. And it's a playlist of all the debates on these related topics. You can find many with TurretinFan, many with Nick Sayers. It's an important topic, and these debates are always a blast to listen to. So, Nick and Turretin, again, excellent job tonight. Now, with tonight's debate being another kind of hyper-specific debate where we focused on one possible error in the King James Bible, this one being Easter. We've just got a few questions, and so we will work through them. Whoever the question is for, we'll make sure that they get the last word. But let's say the question's for TurretinFan. Once TurretinFan answers, Nick, you can feel free to respond, give a rebuttal, and then Turretin will get the last word. So with that, we will start right at closer to the beginning. So Dan Chapa, question for Nick. And I should give a shout out real quick, since Dan Chapa's got a question and TurretinFan is here. We've got an epic 2 versus 2 soteriology showdown coming up for you in May. I'm looking forward to this one. Looks like there's already a lot of hype for this debate. So TurretinFan and Dan Chapa versus Charles Jennings and Eli Haytov. What is true biblical salvation? So this is going to be fun. I'm looking forward to that one. So, okay. So the question for Nick: did Gentile believers in the early church celebrate Passover, including sacrificing lamb?
I doubt the Gentiles would have been doing that. I think the Jews, the year after Jesus died and rose again, they would have been celebrating the Passover with the rest of the Jews like they did annually. But to them, it would have been something different. They would have been seeing all these types and shadows fulfilled. And they would have been saying, hang on, this lamb represents Jesus. He's the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And so after a while, when the Gentiles came into the church, the Pascha celebration went to the Gentile churches. And they were celebrating this yearly. This is my opinion, and so they were celebrating this yearly. But I doubt that they would have carried on with any of the sacrifices and things like that. They just would have. I believe that in 1 Corinthians 11, it is actually talking about the Easter celebration, and so I think that that's not just talking about communion, but it's talking about the annual celebration. Jesus on the Passover day said, do this in remembrance of me. So Passover was a yearly thing. So what he's saying is, instead of killing a lamb, do this in remembrance of me. So I think that just took a while to be instituted, but then eventually that's what started to happen in the churches. They started to not do a lamb, but they would get the bread and they'll get the grape juice and they would do that.
Thank you, Nick, for the response. Turretin, floor is yours.
So in Galatians 2:12, Paul writes to the Galatians and he says, for before that certain time came from, for before that certain came from James, he, that's Peter, did eat with the Gentiles. But when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. And the other Jews dissembled likewise with him, insomuch that Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation. But when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, if thou, being a Jew, livest after the manner of Gentiles, and not as do the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? And similarly in Acts 15, it says, and certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, except you be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. When therefore Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and disputation with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem unto the apostles and elders about this question. So, I mean, to Dan's question, did Gentile believers celebrate the Passover, including animal sacrifice of lambs? Well, if these Gentile believers were taken in, and possibly some were initially taken in, then they may have indeed sacrificed lambs, or killed lambs and put their blood on the doorposts of their house and so forth after the law of Moses, because they thought they have to follow all those laws in order to be saved. Possibly there are some who did that, but Scripture doesn't record it. I don't think church history tells us anything about it. And specifically on this point, we're not told. So it's hard for me to say. But if they did do that, I think that they were missing the point, which is that Christ is our Passover lamb, and Paul mentions that in 1 Corinthians, where he kind of spiritualizes and points the Passover towards Jesus Christ, and speaks of leaven in a spiritual manner, not as to the actual bread we're eating, but in its spiritual sense.
Thank you very much, TurretinFan, for that response. Nick, question was for you. You get the last word.
Yeah, so what TurretinFan's mentioning there in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, it says, in verse 7, it says, "Purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." And so he's saying, get rid of all the leaven. He's talking about the sins and things in your life. But he's saying, let's keep the feast, because Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. He's our Passover lamb. And so it's actually saying to keep this feast. So I wouldn't say that this is just a tradition. I think Christmas is a tradition that people have just sort of made up and gone, okay, let's celebrate the birth of Christ. And I don't find anything particularly wrong with that. I mean, we can celebrate anything about Jesus whenever we want. But a lot of people think that Easter is like that as well. It's just sort of made up. But I don't think that. I think it relates back specifically to the Jewish Passover, and it became the Easter celebration that we have today.
Okay, thank you very much for that final word on that question, Nick. Next question comes in from SWE, $5 super chat. Thank you so much for the support and the question. Question for Nick. Why does the King James Bible translate as Passover all 28 other occurrences of Pascha in the NT except for Acts 12:4?
So every other place where the word Pascha appears, it's in an old covenant sense and an Old Testament sense. Now, the old covenant didn't finish until Christ died, was buried, and rose again. Okay, so even if we're reading in Matthew, we're still reading about people who are under the law. So after that, everything changed. The law became redundant, but it took a while for things to sort of to be understood and things like that. But at the resurrection was when everything changed. And so 28 times the word Pascha appears in the New Testament. It occurs in that period of time. It talks about, the Jewish Pascha was at hand. It talks about the Feast of Passover was at hand. But then this one place in the book of Acts is after the resurrection in the narrative. And so that's the place where in English we have these two words, one meaning resurrection, the other one meaning the Jewish Passover. So the King James translators correctly use the one that means resurrection and put it in that place, because Luke was writing the book of Luke, and he would have been looking at that festival from a Christian perspective.
Thank you, Nick. Turretin, floor is yours.
So SWE, it's not as bad as you think. It's actually much worse. There's not only the 28 places in the New Testament that the King James translators correctly translated this as Passover, but also 14 places or 14 instances in about 12 verses in the Apocrypha, which they also were responsible for translating. It's not part of God's word, but it was also part of their translation project. And in all of those places, they also correctly put Passover. So as to the context of this dictating otherwise, I would have to respectfully disagree, because then were the days of unleavened bread in verse 3 shows that this was the Jewish context. And the fact that the statement about after Pascha is in verse 4, that phrase after Pascha refers to the intent not of Peter or of Luke, but of Herod. And Herod's intent to bring Peter forth to the people. And by the people, he didn't mean Peter's fellow churchmen. He means the Jews, the ones who were going to kill him. So that's what the plan was, but it didn't come to fruition because God sent an angel of the Lord to Peter and miraculously freed him from the jail, despite what people expected.
Thank you, Turretin. Nick, question was for you. Get the last word.
Yes, so I would say it doesn't really matter if the Old Testament has everywhere Pascha, or Pesach in the Old Testament, meaning Passover, or in the Apocrypha, because they're all before the resurrection. So this is the only place where the resurrection is warranted in Acts chapter 12, verse 4. And when it comes down to Herod, when we look at Herod, he would have known about the Christians. He was killing these Christians because they were a pest to him or a pest to the Jews. So he wouldn't have just gone, oh, who are these people? I don't know anything about them, and let's just kill them. He would have known about these things. He would have known that they were usurping the Jewish traditions with their own traditions, and that they were saying, you don't have to be circumcised according to the law of Moses, and so they're not circumcised. They're causing these type of rifts. And so that was one of the things that was happening.
Thank you very much, Nick. Okay, we got a question for TurretinFan. Question from Paul Anchor. Paul, thank you for the question. If the KJV is a flawed translation, which English translation is closer to the Greek and Hebrew original in your view?
Well, in at least one place that I've discussed previously, Nick Sayers' King James Version 2016 is closer in the New Testament than the King James. That would be one example, because in one place he has a wording that, in my view, corrects it. I know that's not Nick's intent there. But so that would be one example. But there might be many other examples as well. I'm not sure. As I said, and I don't know when the question came in, but as I said, I use the King James Version as my English translation, and I've done that for many years, and I don't plan to change. I mean, if I found that there was some other translation that was much better and didn't have the flaws that I see, then I would use that. But for now, I'm in the King James Preferred, which labels me, according to some people, as King James only. But regardless, I don't consider myself to be someone who only uses the King James, especially when I criticize it for having mistakes and so forth. So in any event, bottom line is I don't have a good answer for something better. I was actually very eager to hear, there was recently a debate between two other people on the question of one specific translation up against the King James Version. And I was very eager to hear how that debate would go, because I would love to find out that there's a better translation out there overall. So, but that's not been my experience so far.
Thank you, Turretin, for the response. Nick, floor is yours.
Yes, so I would totally disagree that in the 2016 edition, I've just updated an archaic word. I wouldn't say that it was a mistake or anything like that. But when it comes to the King James, I think that the King James is perfectly adequate in the way it words Easter here. It agrees with our usage that we have today, that the Passover is an Old Testament feast, that Easter is a New Testament feast. And we believe that today. That's our usage. It's been our usage since around the time of 1611. I believe the 1611 Bible was the catalyst that had changed or solidified this change that was happening in English. And so, sorry if you can hear a baby crying in the background. My niece has just come home. And so, but yeah, I would say that the King James perfectly, adequately translates the Greek this way. And so I don't think there's any need to change this. I think Easter should be a word used in Acts chapter 12, verse 4. I'm translating the Urdu Bible at the moment, and even the old Urdu Bible has exactly the same way that the King James has. It has the word Passover every time the King James has it, and it has the exact word Easter. They use the word Easter there in Pakistan. And so they see it that way as well, that's a New Testament word that the early church was using. So I wouldn't get rid of the King James at all.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Turretin, you get the last word on this one.
Well, I was trying to rack my brain, and I don't mean to be too provocative about my comment on the text that I mentioned as a quote unquote correction. I understand that there's some that's not the intent. In terms of trying to find some other versions, I mean, I continue to explore. I hear good things about various translations. I know a lot of other people use the ESV or the Legacy Standard Bible or the NASB and so forth, but those are also not perfect translations, and some of the offsets, especially for me, I really like the these and thous in the text, and there aren't a lot of good translations that keep the thee and thou and fix the other problems. So another nice thing is there's a lot of study tools associated with the King James version as well, a lot of tagged text and so forth. So it's very easy to use and very it's convenient. So I guess that's the short answer to that.
Okay, thank you, Turretin. Next question comes in from Tarkin Sharples. Question for Turretin. If Acts 12:3 places 12:4 after the Passover / the Feast of Unleavened Bread, how can the Pascha equal Passover if Passover is already finished?
Well, that is a point that is worthy of consideration. There is, as I mentioned I went very quickly though in my opening presentation, but there are some uses like Numbers 33:3 or Joshua 4:11 where Passover refers to one day, but usually the idea of Passover, it also sometimes refers to the animal being sacrificed, like the lamb, or the meal at which that animal is eaten. But when it's referred to as a feast, a lot of times it's referred to in connection with with the days of unleavened bread. And together they're referred to as Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread collectively. This from the 14th of Nisan till the 21st of Nisan, or from the 14th of Abib to the 21st of Abib. And that's how it was instituted in Exodus 12. One year in the Old Testament, when it had to be moved, it was moved, and both the day of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, all of it was moved. And then, as I said, Mark 14:12 says the first day of unleavened bread when they killed the Passover. That means that the Passover there is talking about the animal, but that's talking about the first day of the days of unleavened bread is the day on which they killed the Passover. So the entire feast, the entire 8 days, is referred to as Passover. And I think others have noted this. I think in one of the kind of pro-KJV materials I was listening to, pointed out that modern Jewish calendars will sometimes list the entire week as Passover week. So it doesn't mean only that specific day. But it's a good question, because it might be very natural to think, well, how could it be that day if the days of unleavened bread come after the Passover? So good question.
Thank you, Turretin, for the response. Nick, floor is yours.
Yes, so the Passover is a polyseme. The word Passover is a polyseme, which means that it can have multiple meanings. So it can mean the Passover lamb. It can mean the Passover specific day of the 14th of Nisan. It can mean a 7-day period of time. And so there's a lot of different meanings to the word Passover. And so, and Pascha has even more meanings. And so, understanding that when it's talking about in Acts chapter 12, verse 4, it's talking about the weekly celebration of the Passover. That clears everything up. So Herod was wanting to kill Peter after, or intending after the Pascha, the weekly festival, to bring him forward to the people. And understanding that that was going to be about a week long, that makes a lot more sense than it just being the one day of Passover. So it does say them were the days of unleavened bread. A lot of people have made quite a big deal about that, coming from the perspective where they think that Passover is only just that one day, the feast day. But when you understand that it has multiple meanings, and here it most probably means the week-long celebration, that clears that issue up.
Thank you, Nick. Turretin, you get the last word.
No, I appreciate that explanation. And I would just add that Luke himself, in Luke 22:1, says, "Now the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh, which is called the Passover." So Luke endorses that interconnection between the feast of unleavened bread and the Passover. And he then uses in verse 7, then of 22, then came the day of unleavened bread when the Passover must be killed. So that kind of just unites them all together.
Okay, gentlemen, here we go. Final question for the night. The straight gateway. Question for Nick. Why is it absurd to you that Easter in the Bible is referring to the pagan holiday, seeing how the Easter bunny and Easter eggs are celebrating fertility?
Well, I think even relating the goddesses that are supposedly related to Easter, of Ishtar, the goddess of the Phoenicians, and this so-called goddess Yosta, which is apparently a British and German goddess. There's really not much proof for this one, but relating it to these goddesses, the issue of fertility and the issue of eggs, these goddesses weren't specifically to do with eggs and to do with bunnies and to do with anything like that. These goddesses, they had their own specific usage. And so, and none of them were related to bunnies. None of them were related to eggs. And so even that in itself is proof that there's no relation between these two. And so, so the whole concept of a pagan Easter has been thoroughly debunked by many people. And really, it just comes back to Bede. Bede made a list of months, and he says that that Yosta month, or Yosta Moneth, is the month of April. And so he said that that was the month that of this goddess. So he called it Yostamoneth, said it was related to this goddess. But that's about it. I mean, I could say that Thor is related to Thursday. It doesn't mean that there was this huge feast celebrated by anyone on Thursdays or anything like that. And like things like Easter eggs are purely Christian. There's no proof that there was this pagan Easter egg thing. The Christians, when they used to do this fast, I know it can become a religious thing, but they used to, you can't eat the eggs. So you collect them and you paint them and you do things like that. Then on the day you're breaking your fast, you crack the eggs open and you eat them. And so it's like these were purely Christian celebrations. Historians laugh at the whole concept of this pagan holiday being related to the eggs and the bunnies, and because it's just make believe.
Thank you, Nick. Turretin, floor is yours.
So there is a lot of misinformation out there on the internet on this subject, and people really should be very careful and discerning about what they read on the topic. And I say that not to disagree with anything that Nick just said, but from what I know, there's one single mention of Uistra, or whatever the right pronunciation is, and that's the Venerable Bede, from writing many, many centuries ago, and well before the King James translators came around, well before Tyndale, well before Wycliffe, even before some of the Old English translations that we have. And he makes a comment, which may or may not be true, but there's nothing to support that comment. There's no second source that we have to confirm it. And, is there a connection to German? Well, understandably there is, because the Anglo-Saxons are German tribes. And of course, the Old English is sort of a form or species of Germanic, one of the Germanic languages, mixed with some other things as well. But all this to say, even if there is some pagan, even if all of the, what I would say, urban legend stuff is, there's urban legend. You can go online, you can find someone who will say that there's this goddess Uistra, who's born on the equinox, or gives birth on the equinox, or conceives on the equinox, and that she's the goddess of hares or eggs or some other thing. And you go on there, you find it, you'll have a big trouble finding any historical documentation of any of those things. But even if that were true, even if all of that was true, what does that have to do with Pascha? It doesn't have anything to do with Pascha. The name isn't even similar to Pascha. It's just similar to the word in English, Easter. So even if the English Christians in the time of Bede, or in a century before Bede, or whenever it was, borrowed this name of this pagan goddess for the name of that time of year, for the month, the Easter month, that's what it was known as. Even if that was a goddess name, like Thor on Thursday, or Freya I don't know all of the various gods whose names are associated with days of the week in English, but so what if that's what it was? There's no indication that Eusebius was trying to celebrate Easter when he was talking about celebrating Christ's resurrection. And he didn't use the word Easter or any form of it to describe it. Who did? There's the fact that there's this connection between the English word Easter and these pagan gods should have really nothing to do with our discussion, except that there are people who try to promote that the King James is right because of this pagan celebration and try to connect that back to Herod. But that's not right, and Nick doesn't do that. So I don't know. It's not something that needs to be part of this debate. That's why Nick and I didn't get into it, is because I don't make that argument, and Nick doesn't make that argument, and I don't think there's any historical credibility to the idea that there was some goddess who's associated with hares and eggs, although there was an oyster hare in Germany. But what does it have to do with a goddess or celebration? I have no idea. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Turretin, appreciate the response. Nick, question was for you. You get the last word.
Well, the worst case scenario is just say it was related to a goddess of Easter. Even in the Bible, we use words like theos from the Greek that described Greek gods. We use Tartaros, we use Hades. The word of God, when it uses pagan cultures, it comes down to the Hebrew roots type of movement, where anything not Hebrew is considered pagan. And so therefore, how can we translate the Bible into any language without using the words that they use in everyday speech? And sometimes it comes down to borrowing the words, like even sometimes Allah is used in the Bible to describe God. We know that Allah in certain religions and things like that, it's talking about a completely different God. But in some places, the Christians in the Middle East, they say they say Allahu Akbar. They say praise God. The Christians say that in church. And so we would think, oh, that's wrong. And so it just comes down to misunderstanding linguistics. The only thing that Yosta, if it is a real goddess, which I don't even think it is, the only thing that it has to do with Easter is it has the word East in it, or Ost in German, which is like, even Austria is called Österreich. That doesn't mean Austria is evil or Austria is a bad place. It's just the Eastern Kingdom, Österreich. So when you understand these languages, when you go through Germanic, there's nothing evil about the word Ost. And just because there was some goddess, even worst case scenario, well, the Christian Bible uses the words like Hades and things like that. So if that's fine for the New Testament to do it, it should be fine for English people to do it. But I don't even think something like that even existed. And I don't think there is this relationship between the word Easter comes from Auferstehung, which means resurrection. And I believe that people need to stop saying happy resurrection. They need to say happy Easter. Easter means resurrection.
Nick, appreciate that final word. Gentlemen, that concludes the debate. We got 2.5 hours on the topic of Easter. Specifically, the question, is Easter the wrong translation? Turretin, Nick, you both never disappoint. You put in the work, you put in the time, you put in the energy, and I appreciate that, and I know the audience does as well. To the audience, thank you for being so engaged, as always, with these important debates. And we had some great questions, very on-topic questions. So I do want to thank the audience for that. Turretin, Nick, let's get some final words, final thoughts. As always, thank you for the time that you both give us for these awesome debates. Turretin, let's start with you. Again, thanks for doing this. Final words, final thoughts?
Again, thanks, Donny, for hosting and moderating this debate. It's much appreciated. It's a bit of a specialized debate, but I hope it's a blessing and edification to people. Thanks, Nick, as well for I can't remember. I think you were the one who suggested this particular topic, but I'm glad you did, and it builds on our previous debate. So I appreciate that and the opportunity to hash this out more fully than we could in the first one.
Absolutely. When you do these debates, the bigger picture debates like we do just on Bible translations, you only get a small amount of time to discuss each point, right? With these debates, last month we did unicorns. This month we did Easter, and we get a full 2.5 hours to 3 hours on these, as you put it, Turretin. Very specialized debates. So I really enjoy these debates. I know the audience does as well, and therefore I hope to have many more of these kinds of highly specialized debates in the future. Nick Sayers, thank you as always for giving us your time for these debates. Final words, final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say thanks to TurretinFan for he spent a lot of time going through different articles and trying to actually understand what I am saying. Where some people, they just misrepresent what you're saying, or they try and go out of their way to make out you're saying something that you're not. Where I really appreciate that Turretin sort of puts himself into my shoes and tries to understand why I'm saying what I'm saying, and so it makes for a better debate. And I think that it's very good to be able to debate someone who has learnt my side of the picture. And so I really appreciate that.
Well, I appreciate those final words, final thoughts from the both of you. I'm looking forward to having you both back on in the future. Turretin, you've got a couple debates coming up. One on you're going to be debating the Orthodox position in icon veneration. That should be epic. You've also got the 2 verse 2 debate. Nick, you and I are in the final stages of setting you up for some debates on topics that are a little different than what you usually debate here on Standing for Truth. Looks like we'll be getting some eschatology related debates for May and June for you. So it's always a pleasure. Love having you guys on. For the audience sake, I will remind you just a couple real quick reminders right now before we wrap it up. Tomorrow, we've got a Young Earth Creation debate. So Young Earth Creation on trial. This will be at 6 EST, 5 Central. Our team geologist, Professor David McQueen, he'll be debating Taylor from the Snake Was Right YouTube channel. So we do a lot of evolution on trial debates. Tomorrow afternoon, Young Earth Creation on trial. You definitely do not want to miss out on this one. So with that, gentlemen, thank you so much for doing this debate. To the audience, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow, 6 o'clock EST. God bless all. Standing for Truth is out.